rain over the Crestline parking lot. Thursday, Toledo. Vivian Marsh stepped out of a black Audi, heels on wet asphalt. She saw the truck, a Ford F-150. Navy faded to old denim, windshield cracked corner to corner, dried mud along the panel. She turned to her assistant. "Get security to move that thing. This isn't a salvage yard." She walked through the glass doors without looking back. Inside the cab, the man in the driver's seat did not lift his head. He folded the page he was reading and stepped out. 10 minutes later, the front desk called. The Halloran representative had arrived. Vivian Marsh had been CEO of Crestline Automation for 6 months, and in that time she had sat through 4 board meetings where Garrett Vance, her COO, had corrected her in front of the full committee. Not challenged, corrected. The way a patient teacher corrects a student who has given a partially right answer. He did it smoothly, without malice in his voice, which made it worse. Crestline designed and manufactured industrial robotic systems for automotive assembly lines across the Great Lakes region. Their flagship product line, the CR7 series, required a series of precision machined components that only one domestic supplier could produce to spec. That supplier was Halloran Precision Components, out of Oregon, Ohio, 8 miles west of downtown Toledo. The contract between the two companies was worth $47 million a year and had been in place for 11 consecutive years. This afternoon's meeting was a renegotiation. Vance had briefed her on it that morning, leaning against the doorframe of her office with his arms crossed in the way that said he already knew the outcome. He had said, "Halloran is our only domestic option at this tolerance level. That gives them leverage they don't deserve. Come in hard at 18% below current unit pricing. They'll push back, but they need us more than we need them. Make them feel that." What Vance had not told her, and what Vivian had no way of knowing, was that for 11 years, Halloran Precision had sent the same representative to every contract negotiation. Eleanor Brennan, Director of Operations, 63 years old, inefficient and unreadable. The owner of the company had never appeared. Vance had mentioned the owner only once, in passing, describing him as an older gentleman who had largely stepped back from the business. She had not asked follow-up questions. She should have. The man she was thinking of now, the man who owned Halloran Precision, had driven from Mommy that morning in the truck she'd just had moved. His name was Daniel Halloran. He was 41. He wore a flannel shirt the color of pine needles and boots that had seen a factory floor more than an office. He had replaced Eleanor Brennan today because Eleanor was 3 days out from knee surgery and was currently at home with her leg elevated, on strict orders not to walk farther than the kitchen. It was the first time in 6 years that Daniel had attended a contract meeting in person. He had brought a leather satchel, a legal pad, and 3 pages of itemized cost documentation. He had not brought a suit. He had not thought it mattered. Vivian walked into the conference room and opened her folder and looked up. The man from the parking lot was standing at the far end of the table, both hands resting flat on its surface. He was not sitting. He was not checking his phone. He was simply there, the way a piece of load-bearing architecture is simply there. The nameplate in front of him read, "Daniel Halloran, President and Owner." He extended his hand when she reached her chair. The handshake was firm, brief, and free of performance. He said, "Miss Marsh." He sat down. His expression held no reference to the parking lot, no edge of satisfaction, nothing that required her to respond to anything other than the meeting itself. Vivian sat. She opened her folder. Across the table, Garrett Vance uncapped his pen. She led with the 18% reduction proposal at the 2-minute mark. She cited supply chain volatility, competitive market pressure, and the need for Crestline's cost structure to remain viable through the next fiscal realignment. She had rehearsed the language. It landed the way she intended, direct, not apologetic. Daniel listened through all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not take notes. When she finished, he reached into his satchel and removed 3 pages, laid them on the table without fanning them out, and slid them across to her side. "Those are our production cost figures," he said, "broken down by material, labor, machine amortization, and quality control overhead. The numbers are current as of last month." Vivian picked up the pages. The figures were precise and annotated. Every line had a reference. An 18% reduction in unit pricing, Daniel said, would require us to eliminate 40 positions at the Oregon facility. Those are people who live within 8 miles of this building. He paused for one beat. I need to know whether you've accounted for that, or whether that number came from someone else's recommendation. His eyes moved to Vance for exactly 1 second. Not an accusation. A registration. Vance came in smoothly, talking about market benchmarks and supplier responsibility and the necessity of competitive pricing in a difficult environment. He spoke for nearly 90 seconds. Daniel did not look at him during any of it. He kept his eyes on Vivian, waiting, as though Vance had not spoken at all. What Vivian did not know, what no one in that room except Daniel knew, was that Walter Halloran, Daniel's father, had died in 2019, leaving Daniel the sole owner of every share of Halloran Precision Components. Daniel had a degree in mechanical engineering from MIT. He had been approached 3 times by acquisition teams from major industrial conglomerates, and he had declined all 3, politely and without extended negotiation. The company generated $180 million in annual revenue. Daniel had never mentioned that figure in a business conversation. It was not a card he played, it was a fact he lived with quietly, the way he lived with most things. The meeting ended without resolution. Daniel requested a 48-hour pause. He stood, clicked his satchel closed, and thanked Vivian for her time in the same register he might use to acknowledge a door held open. At the threshold of the conference room, he stopped. He turned back to look at her once, not to challenge, not to wound, and said, "The truck in the lot is my father's. He drove it to make the first delivery to this company the year I turned 10. He didn't add anything to that." He walked out. That evening, Vivian sat at her desk with the overhead lights off, working by the glow of her monitor. She typed the name into Bloomberg. The photograph that loaded was from a manufacturing industry conference in Detroit in 2018. Daniel Halloran stood near a podium, in a collared shirt and no tie, shaking hands with the governor of Ohio. His expression in the photograph was the same as it had been across the table from her that afternoon, contained, unhurried, unimpressed by the occasion. She looked at the photo longer than she needed to. She did not sleep well. At 5 in the morning, she was at her desk. At 7, Garrett Vance arrived and found her there, which seemed to surprise him in a way he quickly covered. He leaned in the doorway and said that Halloran was a small operator with a large sense of his own importance, and that 48 hours of silence from their side would make him more reasonable, not less. He said, "Push back hard and he'll come around." He said it the way he said most things, smoothly, conclusively, the conversation already finished in his mind, before it had fully begun. Vivian said she understood. When Vance left, she sat for another 10 minutes without moving. Something in the way he had said it sat wrong, not the words, the ease of them. At 8 in the morning, she drove herself west on Route 20 to Oregon, Ohio. The Halloran facility was a long, low building set back from the street, with a gravel apron and a parking lot that held 40 or 50 cars on a weekday morning. The sign above the entrance was painted steel, not backlit. Eleanor Brennan was waiting near the front entrance, moving with a deliberate care on a set of crutches, her right knee wrapped and elevated on each step. She gave Vivian a tour without being asked whether one was wanted. The production floor was larger than the building suggested from outside. The 5-axis CNC machines ran in 2 parallel rows, each the size of a small cargo van, their housings clean and their operation nearly silent from behind the observation line. The precision they were capable of was measured in microns tolerances that most domestic manufacturers did not attempt, and that no supplier in Guangzhou had yet matched at volume. Every component that came off this floor and went into a Crestline CR7 unit had been touched by one of these machines. Vivian walked past the equipment lockers along the south wall. The name tags on the locks were handwritten in marker and taped over in clear laminate. Some of them had been there long enough that the tape had yellowed. She paused at one. Kowalski, 22 years. 2 lockers down. T. Fuentes, 19 years. She kept walking. She found Daniel in the assembly section without looking for him. He had his left sleeve rolled to the elbow and was crouched beside a younger man at one of the bench stations, pointing to something on the head of a cutting tool with 2 fingers. He looked up when she came into the section, registered her presence with a nod, and said to Eleanor, "Show Miss Marsh the B conference room if she wants to sit down. Not an invitation, not a dismissal, a provision." Vivian did not sit down in conference room B. She stood at its window and looked out at the production floor for 20 minutes. On the drive back to Toledo, she called Vance. She kept her voice even, and told him she wanted to review the complete transaction records for the Halloran account going back 24 months, every invoice, every correspondence, every internal memo touching that contract. Vance said, "Of course." There was a half-second before the words came out, a small gap where the agreement should have been immediate. Vivian noted the half-second. She did not say anything about it. She kept driving. The emergency board presentation happened on a Tuesday. Vance had called it. He framed it as a strategic opportunity that required the board's input before the renegotiation window with Halloran closed. The supplier he introduced was called Yueheng Precision, out of Guangzhou. Their unit pricing came in 31% below Halloran's current rate. The slide deck was polished 11 slides, clean graphics, performance claims that mapped neatly against Crestline's CR7 specifications. It had the texture of something assembled over weeks, not days. Vance presented it with the calm authority of a man who had been carrying this in his back pocket for a long time, waiting for the right moment to set it on the table. Vivian sat through the presentation without expression. She asked 3 technical questions about Yueheng's quality certification and lead times. Vance had answers for 2 of them. The third, about tolerance verification on micro-feature geometries, he deferred, noting that additional documentation could be provided. Afterward, she told the board she wanted an independent quality audit before any supplier decision was finalized. One board member, Richard Calloway, 61, a cautious man who had watched 3 CEOs come and go, and had his own views about this one, raised an eyebrow but didn't object. Vance nodded agreeably. His eyes did not match his nod. Daniel arrived at the Crestline building at 2 in the afternoon, carrying a second folder of supplemental materials Vivian had requested by email that morning. He checked in at the front desk, sat in one of the visitor chairs in the lobby, and waited. He did not cross his legs. He did not look at his phone. A receptionist walked past him twice, and both times he was simply sitting there, reading a page from the folder he'd brought. The meeting was shorter than the first one. Vivian came down herself, rather than having him brought up. They sat at a small table in a ground-floor conference room. She put a new proposal in front of him. Current unit pricing, unchanged. Contract extended to 5 years, a profit-sharing clause that would activate if Crestline's revenue from the CR7 line exceeded defined growth thresholds in years 3 through 5. It was a better offer than anything discussed at the original negotiation, better, Vivian knew, than anything Vance had suggested she offer. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He read through the 2-page document a second time, unhurried. "Is this your decision?" he said, "or the board's?" "Mine," Vivian said. He picked up the pen and signed. He didn't make a ceremony of it. When he stood to go, Vivian said it quietly, "I'm sorry about the truck." He stopped at the edge of the table. He didn't turn around. "You don't need to be," he said. Then he walked out. The apology had cost her something, and the way he'd received it had cost her something different. She sat alone in the conference room for a minute after the door closed, the signed document in front of her, and tried to identify what she was feeling. She couldn't quite. She filed that away and went upstairs. The defect report appeared on her desk the following Thursday. Vance had flagged it a batch of precision shafts from Halloran's most recent delivery, showing micro-fractures on the bearing journals. The report included photographs, measurements, cross-references to CR7 assembly tolerances. It was thorough, and it was damning, and it came with a recommendation that Vivian countersign a formal recall notice and notify the board by end of day. She read it twice. Something about the photographs was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. The fractures were in exactly the right place to be damaging, documented in exactly the right way to be convincing. It was too neat. She drove out herself instead of signing. The rain that afternoon came in heavy and horizontal, the kind that turns every low stretch of road into a temporary river. 3 miles from the Halloran facility, her car lost power without warning. No sound, no drama, just a quiet surrendering of the electrical system. She coasted to the shoulder and sat with her hazards on, rain hammering the roof. The Ford came from behind her, going the opposite direction. She saw it in the mirror, watched it slow, watched it pull a U-turn on the empty county road with a methodical 3-point turn. It pulled up beside her. Daniel put the window down. He didn't say anything about the car. He didn't mention the rain or the road, or the fact that she was sitting alone in a $50,000 vehicle that had apparently decided it was done for the day. He just said, "Come on." The heater in the Ford ran loud and warm. He drove without speaking. The windshield wipers worked at a steady, unhurried pace. At the facility, Eleanor made coffee in the break room off the inspection hall. Daniel took the flagged batch to the metrology table under the microscope array and went through it component by component while Vivian watched. He talked her through what he was seeing as he worked the refracted light under the lenses, the reference marks on the gauge blocks, the acceptable deviation ranges that Crestline's own engineering specifications allowed for. He showed her the measurement logs from the outgoing quality control check initialed by his floor supervisor 2 days before the delivery. There were no microfractures. The variation in the bearing journals fell within the tolerance band specified by Crestline's own engineering team. The components were correct. The report was not. Vivian sat on a metal stool at the inspection bench after he finished, her coffee growing cold beside her. She didn't say anything for a while. Daniel moved to the adjacent bench and began reviewing a separate set of drawings, giving her the silence without making it into a gesture. Eventually, he told her about the first time his father had let him run a lathe alone. He was 12. The part he'd made had a 3% deviation in diameter within tolerance, barely. His father had looked at it under the gauge, set it down, and asked only, "Do you know where you went wrong?" Not what went wrong. Where? Vivian thought about that for a moment. "Did you?" Eventually, Daniel said. He drove her back to Toledo at 9 in the evening. The rain had thinned to a mist. He didn't turn the radio on. The last 15 minutes passed without either of them speaking, and neither of them reached for something to fill it. She was at her desk by 7 the following morning. She made a call to an independent auditing firm using the number she had found herself, not one drawn from Crestline's pre-approved vendor list. She did not tell Vance she was making it. She looked out the window at the parking lot below while the phone rang. She was thinking about 15 minutes of silence on a county road in the dark, and what it meant that it had not felt uncomfortable. Eleanor Brennan arrived at the Crestline executive floor on a Tuesday morning without an appointment. She was still using one crutch. She told the assistant at the front desk that she needed 10 minutes with Miss Marsh on a matter she could not explain to anyone else first. Vivian came out to the lobby herself. They went to her office. Eleanor sat down and placed a manila envelope on the desk between them without preamble. Inside the envelope were 5 documents. The first was a printed email chain. It ran 14 months back, a series of messages between a Crestline corporate email address registered to G. Vance and a procurement contact at Yuehang Precision in Guangzhou. The exchange began as what appeared to be a routine quality inquiry and evolved across 7 messages into a detailed arrangement. Vance would facilitate the displacement of Halloran Precision as Crestline's primary component supplier in exchange for a private consulting arrangement payable to a numbered LLC at 6% of the first year's contract value. The second document was a bank statement from a Cayman Islands institution showing 3 wire transfers into that LLC account over the course of the previous year. The amounts were consistent with the agreed percentage. The third was a draft notice of contract termination addressed to Halloran Precision Components, dated 3 weeks before Vivian's first meeting with Daniel. The signature line read, "Vivian Marsh, Chief Executive Officer, Crestline Automation." The signature was not hers. She had never seen this document before this moment. The fourth and fifth were internal Crestline memos, both routed under Vance's name, establishing a justification trail for the supplier transition that referenced quality concerns and cost volatility concerns that did not appear in any operational report from that period. Eleanor said, "I've had these for a year. I didn't give them to Danny because he would have dealt with it quietly, and the man who did it would have walked away clean. I'm giving them to you because you're the one Vance is trying to destroy, and because Danny walked into that first meeting still believing you had signed that termination letter." Vivian sat with that for a moment. She thought about Daniel in the conference room, listening to her 18% reduction proposal with complete composure. She thought about the parking lot, the comment about the truck, the 4 words she'd said without looking back. She thought about the drive home in the rain, the signed contract, the apology he'd accepted without requiring anything from her in return. He had believed, through all of it, that she was the person who had tried to end 40 jobs with a forged signature, and he had still driven her home in the dark. Vivian sat still for 5 minutes. Then she reached for her phone and called the company's outside counsel. She laid every document on the desk in a single row. She did not contact Vance. She drove to Oregon that afternoon. Daniel's truck was not in the facility lot. Eleanor had sent him a message ahead, letting him know she'd be stopping by the house on another matter. Vivian drove to the address in Maumee, a 2-story craftsman on a quiet street, the kind of house where things got repaired rather than replaced. She rang the bell. Daniel opened the door. She handed him the envelope without explanation. He took it and read it standing in the doorway. He read carefully and completely, the way he did everything. When he reached the termination letter, the one with her name on it, he went still for a moment. Then he finished reading and looked up. His eyes were not angry. They were tired, in the way of someone who has been carrying weight that did not belong to him for a long time and has just discovered the weight was heavier than he knew. "I owe you an apology," he said. She shook her head. "No, you don't owe me anything." He looked at her for a moment, the envelope still in his hands, rain beginning in the street behind her. Neither of them moved. The board meeting was on a Friday morning, 10 days after Eleanor's visit to the executive floor. Vance had arranged the room in his own way. He arrived early, chose the seat at the far end of the table that put him opposite Vivian rather than beside her, and positioned himself next to Richard Calloway and 2 other members whose votes, Vivian had come to understand, he had been cultivating for months. Vivian opened the meeting without any preamble about what was coming. She laid out the independent audit results first, the flagged batch from Halloran, the photographs in Vance's report, the actual metrology readings taken under calibrated laboratory conditions. The components were within specification. The defect report was fabricated. Vance interrupted. He said the audit was premature and that she was mischaracterizing his quality concerns. He said it with the same smooth authority he always used, but Vivian let him finish and then kept going. She placed the email chain on the table. She walked through it without editorializing dates, names, dollar amounts. When she reached the part where the percentage was negotiated, she stopped and let the room read. Vance said it was taken out of context. He said the word baseless. He started to say something about regulatory frameworks and due diligence, and then Vivian put the bank statement on the table. 3 wire transfers. A Cayman account. A numbered LLC registered at an address in Delaware that shared a zip code with a law firm that had once represented a real estate company connected to Vance's brother-in-law. The room was quiet. She put the termination letter on the table last. The door at the far end of the conference room opened, and Daniel Halloran walked in. Vivian had called him the previous evening and asked him to come. She had told him he could decline and she would understand. He had said, "What time?" He stood near the door and addressed the board in 3 sentences. He said that Halloran Precision Components would continue supplying Crestline Automation under the terms of the signed agreement. He said the supply relationship was stable and would remain so. He said the only condition he was putting forward was that the person responsible for the termination letter not retain decision-making authority over the contract. He said it quietly, without looking at Vance. Then he folded his hands and waited. Richard Calloway, who had spent 20 years on boards and who had learned to read rooms before the furniture was even arranged, looked from Daniel to Vivian. He said, "How long have you known about this supplier relationship, Miss Marsh?" Vivian said, "I met Mr. Halloran for the first time 3 weeks ago, in the parking lot downstairs. I had his truck flagged for removal. She did not soften it. I didn't know who he was." Calloway held her gaze for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not approval exactly, recognition. Then Vance stood up. His voice was no longer smooth. He said that Vivian's relationship with a supplier was a conflict of interest, and that the board needed to consider what had actually motivated her to pursue this investigation. He used the word personal. He used it more than once. Daniel said, "You're describing a woman I've met exactly 5 times. He said it quietly and without heat. 4 of those times were about you. The room went completely still. The motion to suspend Vance, pending an outside investigation, passed without dissent. Calloway requested that the company's legal team initiate a referral to federal investigators regarding the Cayman account. Vance was escorted to his office to collect personal items under HR supervision. Daniel left before the room had fully cleared. Vivian caught up with him at the elevator bank in the hallway. The doors had already opened. He stepped in and turned, and she was standing at the threshold with her hand on the doorframe. She said, "Thank you." He looked at her for one moment, something passing through his expression that she couldn't entirely name. Then he nodded once, and the doors closed between them. In the week that followed, the company steadied itself. An interim COO was appointed from within the operations division. The board, which had spent 6 months treating Vivian with the specific wariness they reserved for leaders they had not yet decided to trust, began scheduling meetings with her rather than around her. Calloway called on a Wednesday to say, without elaborating, that the audit had been thorough work. Vivian signed the 5-year contract with Halloran Precision on a Thursday. Daniel countersigned without requesting any modifications to the terms. A copy went to each party by courier, and one went into the Crestline legal files. There was no ceremony around it. She called him that evening and asked if he'd let her take him to dinner. She said it was to thank him properly. He said he appreciated the offer and that he would have to pass, and he said it without giving a reason, and she found that she understood without needing one. 3 days later, he called her. Eleanor was organizing the annual dinner for the facility's long-term employees, a tradition that had started under Walter Halloran in the late 1980s, a single long table in the production bay after the machines went quiet, with food brought in from the diner on Route 20. He asked if she wanted to come. He said it the way he said most things in a register, that made it feel like a practical question, rather than an invitation. She said yes before she thought about it. She arrived in a blue wool sweater, no blazer. She hadn't worn something without a blazer outside of her apartment in months, and was mildly surprised by how different the air felt on her arms. The production bay smelled of machine oil and something warm from the chafing dishes at the near end of the long table. There were maybe 40 people seated, and a few more standing at the edges. The volume in the room had the texture of a gathering where everyone knew each other's names. She sat near the middle of the table, one seat down from Daniel. Eleanor stood at the head and told the story of the first delivery Walter Halloran, the winter of 1987, a pickup truck with a bad heater, a shipment of 40 precision components packed in foam, and a highway outside Toledo that was mostly ice. He had driven it alone and arrived on time and shaken the hand of the Crestline plant manager, a man named Duttweiler, and accepted a cup of coffee he held, with both hands because his fingers were stiff from the cold. Daniel listened to the story the way someone listens to music they know very well but have not heard in a long time. He did not perform attention, he simply held it. Vivian looked at the people around the table, the machinists and inspectors and team leads who had spent large portions of their working lives in this building, and understood something she hadn't been able to access from across a conference table. She understood why he had never sold. When she left, she walked through the employee parking lot to reach the street. The Ford was parked near the far fence under one of the tall yellow overhead lights. She stopped when she reached it. She stood there for a moment. The lot was quiet except for the sound of traffic on the road beyond the fence. She put one hand on the hood, the metal cold and solid under her palm, and held it there for a few seconds. Then she went to her car and drove home. The cold settled into Toledo properly by November, the kind that came off Lake Erie and made the city hunker down into itself. Vivian wore her coat to the parking lot each morning and sat in her car for a full minute before starting the engine, not because it needed warming, but because she had started to value the 1 minute before the day began. The board gave her full restructuring authority at the November meeting. Calloway brought the motion himself. She noticed Daniel's presence in her days, in the way you notice weather, not because it announced itself, but because its absence would have been felt. A bag of coffee beans from Toledo Roastery appeared on the front desk one Wednesday with no card. The beans were from a Guatemalan producer she had mentioned, in passing, during the quality inspection at the facility, mentioned once, in a single sentence, while waiting for Eleanor to finish something. She hadn't thought he'd registered it. A technical drawing arrived by inter-office courier the following week. It was a schematic for the bearing journal component she had asked about during the metrology session, annotated in Daniel's handwriting along the left margin, explaining a step in the grinding process that she had admitted to not fully understanding. The annotations were clear and not condescending. They answered the question she had actually had, not a simplified version of it. She drove to Mommy on a Saturday afternoon in December. He was on a ladder at the roofline, adjusting a gutter that had pulled away from the fascia. She parked at the curb and he came down when he saw her, climbing with a deliberate ease, wiping his hands on his jeans when he reached the ground. He nodded. He didn't ask why she'd come. They sat in the kitchen. He made coffee pour over, unhurried, and set a mug in front of her without asking how she took it, which she realized afterward was because he already knew. She had mentioned it during the metrology session, along with the Guatemalan beans. On the counter beside the refrigerator, there was a framed photograph. An older man, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, standing in front of the Halloran facility entrance. He was grinning openly, one hand resting on the hood of the Ford. The truck in the photograph was younger than it was now, the blue paint unweathered. Daniel saw her looking. He said the truck was his reminder. Every morning when he walked past it in the lot, he remembered who he was before he walked through the door. Vivian looked at the photograph for a long time. She said, "I don't have anything like that." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He held his mug with both hands, looking at the window above the sink. Then he said, "You're looking." She wasn't sure if he meant the truck or something else. She didn't ask. When she stood to leave, he walked her to the door. She had her keys in her hand, and she was pulling her coat on, and there was a brief moment at the door when he reached past her to hold it open, the old-fashioned kind that required a lift at the handle, and her hand and his hand were both on the metal plate at the same instant. Neither of them moved for a moment. She said goodnight. He said goodnight. She went to her car. On the drive back to Toledo, the heater worked too well and she cracked the window, and the cold air came in off the Maumee River, and she drove the rest of the way with one hand on the wheel, thinking about very little, which was unusual for her. Spring came late to Toledo that year, arriving somewhere in the middle of March with a hesitant warmth that the city accepted without complaint. By April, the trees along the Maumee riverfront had leafed out green, and the parking lots were dry in the mornings, and the whole region seemed to let out a breath it had been holding since October. It was raining lightly on a Thursday afternoon when Vivian walked out of the Crestline building at 20 minutes past 5. The same kind of rain it had been the first day, fine and persistent, the kind that doesn't make you run. She stopped at the edge of the entrance overhang. The Ford was parked in the visitor section near the entrance pillar. The same faded navy, the same crack across the windshield, the same dried mud along the lower panel that no rain had yet softened. Daniel was standing with his back against the driver's door, hands in his jacket pockets, not looking at anything in particular. She walked toward him. She didn't hurry. She stopped when she reached the truck. She looked at it, actually looked, the way she hadn't in the first moment, standing with it 6 months behind her and her back turned. The crack, the paint, the dent above the rear wheel arch that she hadn't noticed before. Daniel was quiet beside her. She said, "Are you ever going to repaint it?" He said, "Not yet." She opened the passenger door herself and climbed in. The interior smelled the same as it had the night of the rain, old vinyl and machine oil, and something faintly like sawdust. The seat was set for someone taller than her, and she didn't adjust it. Daniel came around the hood and got in. He buckled his belt, checked the mirror, and turned the engine over. The Ford caught with a low, rough sound, not apologetic, not performative, just functional. Present. A guard in the security booth at the lot entrance looked up when he heard it, saw the old truck idling in the visitor lane with its turn signal blinking, and moved toward the window with the intention of checking whether it had a valid pass. Then he saw the woman in the passenger seat and recognized her. He went back to his chair. They pulled out of the lot and into the Thursday afternoon traffic on Jefferson Avenue, wipers moving at their familiar pace. The city sat wet and lit around them, the early lights of downtown Toledo coming on against the gray sky. 5 minutes passed. She watched the storefronts on the passenger side, the way they slid past, one and then the next. She could hear the wipers. She could hear the engine. He asked, "Are you hungry?" She said yes. He turned left at the next intersection. Not toward downtown, not toward any restaurant she'd been to, not toward anything she could have predicted from the direction they'd started. The rain was lighter now. The street they were on ran along the river, and the water caught the last of the gray sky and held it. They never spoke again about the first afternoon in that parking lot, but on nights when the rain came down fine and steady on the road between Toledo and Maumee, both of them knew, and neither of them had any need to say so.